Many people wake up each day not to the sound of an alarm clock on a table, but to the whir of a small machine that shakes under a pillow. Like the deaf-mute in the gospel, these people live in a silent world. For them, turning on the radio is useless. Watching TV is a bland experience. Having a conversation with someone else is virtually impossible. But the plight of a physical deaf mute is nothing compared to the spiritual plight of someone who is spiritually deaf and mute. That is, someone who can't hear God, someone who can't talk to God in prayer. And all of us fall into this category at some part in our life. And the truth is, spiritually, many of us, we live in a silent world, unable to communicate spiritually. So the story is told of Franklin Roosevelt, who often endured long receiving lines at the White House. Well, he complained that no one would pay attention to him, to what he was saying in these events. And so one day during a reception, he decided to try an experiment. So to each person who passed down the line and shook his hand, he murmured, "I murdered my grandmother yesterday." Well, the guests responded with phrases like, "Marvelous, keep up the good work. We are proud of you. God bless you, sir." And it wasn't until the end of the line, while greeting the ambassador from Bolivia, that his words were actually heard. And without hesitation, the ambassador leaned over and whispered, "I'm sure she had it coming." He was listening. I think for the most part, we all struggle at some level with listening. It's a problem, a way of life that we've all become way too accustomed to. And the problem of our inability to listen spiritually also and inevitably affects our ability to speak spiritually. Just like in a physical deafness, you could hardly speak when you are physically deaf. Same thing with spiritual deafness. The many activities in which we are involved, the many concerns that keep us preoccupied, and then the noise that is constantly surrounding us, it makes it so hard for us not only to hear the ones closest to us, but the God who's within us, speaking so gently to us. At the same time, we may feel unfulfilled and wonder if being busy but bored, involved yet lonely, is a symptom of our modern life. The life in which we no longer hear the voices of those we love, and especially the voices of the one who created us out of love and for love. Friends, today's world is a hard world in many different ways. But the greatest of news is proclaimed to us in our gospel. Today we hear that in our gospel is that not only does God exist, but God also is actively present in our lives. And He's often present in and through those who we love and love us. You see, friends, the reality is that we have a God who cares, a God who heals, a God who guides us and directs us, a God who challenges us, He confronts us and He forms us. Our God is a God who wants to lead us closer to the full realization that He is with us all the time, even if we can't hear Him. Yet He speaks to us in a multiplicity of ways. See, the truth is that developing ears to hear God, it takes time, since we all have a strong resistance to listening, not only to our loved ones, but to the loved one. But we can do it. We can do it because God gave us one mouth and two ears for a reason. Okay, but how do we hear God's voice in a world in which everything is so loud, busy, and distracting? Well, I'd like to offer two really, really simple ways. The first is this: be still more often and use your ears more than your mouth. Be still more often and use your ears more than your mouth. I once saw this framed sign that read, "Be still and listen to the Lord, for the world is loud and God whispers." Be still and listen to the Lord, for the world is loud, but God whispers. Mother Teresa would often say, you want to hear God? Well, God speaks in the silence of our hearts because he's an intimate God. We experience constantly how loud and distracting the world is. So many different forms of media are constantly fighting for our attention. It's so difficult to sit in silence for 5 to 10 minutes. Actually, one thing that I often see when I'm out and I see a young couple is as soon as they're done ordering their meal from the menu, there's like 10 seconds of silence and each pulls out their phone. We're not comfortable with silence, but yet silence is where growth happens. A baby grows in the womb in silence. Things in nature grow in silence. It's interesting how immediately after the crowd introduces the deaf man to Jesus in our gospel, we're told this: he took him off by himself away from the crowd. He took him off away by himself from the crowd. This is indicative of how separation from the noises of the world is so important for us. Friends, and I'm not advocating that we should leave our families and our jobs and run away and go live in a monastery. No. But what I am saying is that in order for us to hear God speak to us more clearly, we need to create spaces in our lives where we actively listen to him. So developing those ears to hear God, it takes time and effort because we're all so resistant to listening. It's undeniable that resistance in the form of preoccupation and distraction often prevents us from seeing the truth in our lives, from hearing God's voice, and from living a spiritual life. To listen with obedience to the voice of God, it requires building up a resistance to all the voices that compete for our attention. You can't take all things at once. So what you have to do is separate some things in order to listen to one thing. Be still and listen to the Lord, for the world is loud and God whispers. Okay, so finally, number 2. Encounter and listen to God's word in the scriptures in the Bible. How can you know somebody if you don't make time to get to know that person? Try this mental exercise. Think about someone you know really, really well. Maybe it's a spouse or a neighbor, a friend, a sibling. Think about that person. When you really get to know someone, they don't even have to speak for you to know that they are there with you. I learned this with my mom. She could come into the room and I know by the way she walks and how she breathes that it's her. She doesn't have to say one word. And usually she was coming to get me in trouble. But we build those intimate relationships and that knowledge of people so intimately that they don't even have to speak for us to know who they are. Friends, do we know Jesus well enough to spot when he walks into our lives? We need to learn to listen to the voice by encountering him in his book, the Bible, which is his love letter to us. A great place to start is our second reading, the letter of St. James, or the Gospel of Matthew. And I've mentioned this before as a resource. A great podcast, Bible in the Year podcast by Father Mike Schmitz. Phenomenal resource, 20 minutes a day. He reads the scriptures and he provides a little reflection. I love it. It's phenomenal. So these are the 2 ways. In some way, we're meant today to identify with the deaf man in the gospel to whom Jesus says, Ephphatha, be open. Friends, like the deaf man, we too suffer from spiritual deafness. And like the same man, we can allow the Lord to touch us and to heal us so that we can listen more attentively to his voice in our hearts and in the world around us. Because this prayer, Ephphatha, be open, is the prayer of every disciple. Because every disciple needs it. May we be open to the presence of God in our lives by making more time for him, by being more attentive to him, so that we can get to know him, and then we can hear him. Friends, spiritually, we're all like the deaf man. And like the deaf man, we don't have to stay that way.